Hey everybody, I'm hoping that you already watched the On This Day in History and Current Events video for today. What is today? March 31st. I know this day might seem a little bittersweet as it was the original day that was going to be the last of our days apart, but we'll get through April. We'll be okay. We will persevere and we're learning new stuff and readjusting our perspective on life along the way. This section is going to be relatively short in part because you're doing some of the homework for it, so hopefully you already saw the assignment that I listed on Johnson's Great Society. I also posted a video on Johnson's Great Society on the Facebook page that you could take a look at to see. Your book barely scratches the surface on what all he did. It's interesting, John Green says something that I've been saying for years, which is if it wasn't for his personal style, the Johnson treatment, we called it, and the escalation in Vietnam, he might be seen as one of the greatest presidents of all time, especially for liberals or for people who are on the far left Democratic side of the spectrum. He got a lot of work done, made America more of what it is today, especially when it comes to people who are not middle and upper class. He gave a lot of helping hands and had a lot of really great and amazing programs that he instituted, many of which are still in place today. But let's get started with the first slide. So section 3, the Great Society, Johnson takes reins. So you can see how he gets sworn in on Air Force One with Jackie standing next to him. That's where we ended. At the end of Section 2 after Jack or John F. Kennedy got assassinated. Lyndon Baines Johnson, usually just called LBJ, big tall Texan, took office and set out to do a lot of the things that Kennedy had started that he himself could not finish. Johnson grew up in poverty, and so he had a lot of experience with what it was like to be without, and that helped him in his approach and helped him in understanding what it was like to not be a Washington insider, for instance, and not be have an easy go at life. But he did have a long career in Congress. He was pretty well established, and people knew him. He had worked with both Democrats and Republicans throughout his time in Congress. His leadership style, though, was markedly different than Kennedy's. As I mentioned, it was called the Johnson treatment. If he wanted you to do something and you did not want to do it, he would go to great lengths to bully you into doing it, basically. And this is a great picture to show how he can kind of be in your face. He would bargain, he would flatter, he would take away privileges, he would make threats, he would refuse to sign something that would help your congressional district. He was very keen on dropping the F-bomb and other swear words in the Oval Office, and we have lots of Oval Office tapes of him using quite foul language that we would not think becoming of a president while working with his associates and with his assistants and with the other secretaries while in the Oval Office. He found it really difficult to be able to work with the long-established Eastern Seaboard government establishment, I guess, in D.C., even though he had been in Congress for a really long time. I think part of the reason was because he was so gruff, at times quite rough, and didn't mince words. He did not. He didn't really believe in you pat my back, I'll pat yours. You do what I tell you to do because I'm telling you to do it. So he was a rather rough and tumble guy. Like I said, he was a cowboy, grew up on a ranch in Texas, was just cut from a different cloth, definitely, than what Kennedy was, who was quite suave, had come from a well-established, wealthy, and very polished family in Massachusetts. That was not LBJ. So he decided that the war on poverty was one of his top agenda items, and there's more than one way to engage in war on poverty. John Green talks about this. This is so true. Don't engage in war on a noun, whether it's the war on poverty, the war on crime, the war on drugs, the war on terror. Those never really end well, although you could then argue war against Germany, war against, but those are nouns too. But the war on poverty. So he's going to look at some of the programs that Kennedy had wanted to put into place, but he's going to extend those and go beyond those. And he's going to look at the different programs at different levels that can help all sorts of people in poverty. So, just a few weeks into taking office, he did the usual State of the Union address, which is required by the Constitution. It usually happens in January of most years, and he had only been in office for just shy of 2 months based on when Kennedy died, and he said he was going to engage in an unconditional war on poverty. Shortly thereafter, he convinces Congress to pass the Economic Opportunity Act, which is going to open the Office of Economic Opportunity, which for those of you who have jobs, you will see posters in your job places talking about how you needed to be treated equitably and have fair working conditions. And that is kind of a stayover from or a holdover from this Economic Opportunity Act. He really wanted to focus, though, on making sure that places in inner cities had job opportunities available for youth, but then also because so many poor and African American youth, especially, and other immigrant youth, didn't have the access to really good schools yet, definitely didn't have the access to job training programs, to four-year college institutions, or even to trade schools in many cases. He invented or created Job Corps, which is still a part of government today, in which if you're unemployed and you apply to the program and you get picked up, they will train you, they will help you find a first job. And so Job Corps is a great opportunity for people who perhaps didn't get the best secondary education that was out there. He finishes 1964. Kennedy was elected in 1960, became president in January of 1961, got assassinated in November of 1963, and that means that Johnson finishes almost exactly 1 year of JFK's term, which means he can run actually for 2 full terms for himself if he wanted to. So he runs for re-election in 1964. He wins by a landslide against Barry Goldwater, who was from Arizona. Barry Goldwater got his own state. That's not always the case with candidates. It's interesting to see when they don't get their own state. That's usually a pretty bad sign. And he got some of the Deep South because Goldwater had a few America for white American tendencies. He wasn't as bad as some of those Southern governors that we'll see in the Civil Rights chapter, but he had made some rather racist comments during a couple of his rallies, and therefore that Deep South, who wanted to kind of keep things the way they were, even though times were changing, voted for him also. But you can see everyone was pretty confident with what Johnson had already been doing. Why change? And he had only been there for about a year, so let's see what else he can do. Love this comic book, the Great Society comic book. I actually just found some information about, for the AP class, about comic books and their connection with the Cold War, and how comic books really were started as a way to help children understand the concepts of the Cold War, who the good guys were and the bad guys were. And if you're really interested in comic books and the history of comic books and how all that started, just send me a quick email. I'll send you some of the information that I found for the AP class. So his Great Society. So now would be the perfect time for you to pause me, watch that quick history video on YouTube about the Great Society, and then come back. And at the same time, I want you to open your book to page 727. You can pause me while you do that. Okay, so here we go. So you see some major Great Society programs on 727, but that is in no means all of it. So presidents usually have what they call like a program or a proposal or a plan. And there's been lots of different names for these plans over the years. Teddy Roosevelt had the Square Deal, for instance. And Kennedy had the New Frontier. Johnson has what he called the Great Society. He delivered this in a graduation speech, actually, that he delivered in probably May or June of 1964. And he talked about how they were going to engage in a war against poverty, and they were going to help pull up all these people that were on the fringes of society or living in poverty, so that we can have a more equitable society, and so that everyone could appreciate and live under the American dream. And so as you look at the chart on 727, it categorizes it really nicely for you. And these are the names of the programs you're going to be doing that Google Excel or that spreadsheet for me, to help share the information with each other. Look for that assignment. It needs to be completed by midnight of Wednesday night, tomorrow night. So we have health and welfare programs, okay, which include Medicare and Medicaid, which still exist today, and the Child Nutrition Act, which has been tweaked multiple times, but that's why you are forced to grab fruits and vegetables for your school lunch when you get hot lunch. And then under the education programs, we have Elementary and Secondary Ed Act, the Higher Ed Act, which has to do with colleges and equitability and accessibility of colleges. And then Head Start, which was a huge program. I'll talk about that in a moment. And then the War on Poverty, specifically the Office of Economic Opportunity that I already talked about, Housing and Urban Development, which is called HUD. HUD is huge yet today, especially in inner cities, but there are a fair amount of HUD apartment complexes around Bend and Redmond. Look for them. On the sign, it will actually say Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. And then an act having to do with the metropolitan development areas. And this is how we're going to make a whole lot of what in the 80s we used to call projects. Low cost rentals, huge complexes in places like Chicago and Minneapolis and New York and Philadelphia. And then under consumer and environmental protection, the Clean Water and Air Acts, the Highway Safety Act, which is eventually going to lead to a mile per hour regulation, which comes under Carter's administration as a way of actually saving fuel, and seatbelts and stuff like that. And then the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act, which just is kind of an add-on to the Labeling Act that came to being under Teddy Roosevelt, actually, the Food and Drug Act. But these three programs right here on this slide are really important. Medicare and Medicaid are healthcare programs that essentially provide kind of a government form of insurance for the elderly, which is Medicare, and then for those who could not have access otherwise, often because they are not employed, because they are people with disabilities or incredible health issues that need government assistance. So Medicare for 65 and older, Medicaid can be regardless of age. And then for Head Start is a preschool program. So what they were beginning to really see is there's a great difference for kids that came in either at the kindergarten or the first grade level. It takes a long time for kindergarten to be required more or less in every state. It grows slowly, but it's not really seen as required. It's more seen as optional at this point in time. And there was a great discrepancy in school readiness between kids from middle and upper class families where moms were at home helping them to learn their letters and their numbers and their colors and counting and using scissors and all that sort of stuff. And kids who were in poverty, often at daycare or staying with relatives during the day, not getting that same sort of preschool education and training that makes them successful in elementary school, which then would make them behind for all of their schooling. And so Head Start was and is a program that enables preschoolers to be ready for school, basically. And it exists and even today in small towns and in big towns, in big cities. Johnson came into the office determined to change the U.S. And the last paragraph on 729, this is kind of a paraphrase of that last paragraph. He wanted to make some long-term changes. He didn't get everything done that he wanted to get done. I think part of it was because we were only ready for so much change at one time, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about the civil rights movement in the next chapter, but also because he gets really distracted by Vietnam, and we'll talk about that in chapter 17. But he makes a great change. And as I said at the very beginning of this, if it wasn't for Vietnam, if it wasn't perhaps for his incredibly gruff style and his potty mouth, perhaps he would be seen as one of the best presidents we ever had. But because of other things, his reputation could be really tarnished. We get the same thing a little bit with Nixon. When I say Nixon, you automatically think Watergate and horrible president. Nixon does some really amazing stuff, especially when it comes to international relations. I'll talk about that when we get to Nixon, but everyone gives him a bad rep because of Watergate. Most everyone gives Johnson a bad reputation because of Vietnam, which isn't really fair because he was a great humanitarian for the poor, for the minorities in the United States. So there we go, all about President Johnson. I'll see you next time for chapter 16-1. Don't forget to do your part on the spreadsheet about Johnson's Great Society programs, and just keep an eye on Google Classroom for whatever it is you need to do. You can hand in current events pages whenever, and I will talk about them like how I talked about one or two of them today. Stay healthy, wash your hands, and I'll see you soon.